that was the quote of the president, but before you've just come back from Davos, and you've been to the Ukrainian lunch, which is organized already for the decades. So what were the highlights? What were the most important? What is the, the atmosphere? What are the foreign politicians first of all interested to hear from the Ukrainian leader? And about what's going on in Ukraine?
I think that the major, I would say, surprise to me is that the most of the international politicians whom I met were rather inclined to ask questions about Ukraine than provide recommendations. So the major attitude was a kind of the question to Ukraine to explain what's going on in the country. So it is not so easy for the most of the international actors just to say what to do. It would be very, I would say, naive to say that everybody knows what Ukraine must do. It is not so easy. So that is why the most of the politicians, the most of the counterparts we met were rather about the asking questions, not giving us receipt what we can do, what we should do.
But before, probably the last and the most interesting meeting was with the U.S. head of the State Department, Rex Tillerson. There were expectations that the Ukrainian president will meet Donald Trump, but there was a lot of excitement about Donald Trump finally, the U.S. president, coming to Davos, so that meeting hadn't happened. What we know about the results of that meeting, because and how we can, now explain and describe the state of the U.S.-Ukraine relations, also with those promises and this expectation to get a defense lethal weapon from the U.S.
So the major point of these talks was about coordination of the major points and positions between two governments where it is possible. So it is very important that on the highest level there is a continuous process of coordination, because the only way to achieve some progress in the very complicated issue of our conflict with Russia is to have coordinated position with our Western allies. And here I think that with the U.S. Secretary of State, it was exactly the point when on the top level the positions on what we are looking for was discussed. So it is really important that both United States and Ukraine are looking for coordinated approach and on various issues, how to deal with peacekeepers mission, which is discussed, what to do with the sequence of steps when it comes to the Minsk Agreement implementation, and what about the conditionality, which usually is important when it comes to American assistance to Ukraine, and in particular American position in the international financial institutions. For example, we know that there is a big debate about the Ukrainian incompliance with some conditions which International Monetary Fund raises in order to give Ukraine a continuation of its program. So, and I think that it was also debated. But the major point with Tillerson was about Donbas, I am sure. And that was exactly the case when we are in the process of the big bargain over the idea of international peacekeepers. And I think that this is very important to be on the same page with the United States on this issue.
We also, at Davos, Poroshenko, Ukrainian president, has boasted about his anti-corruption efforts, and of course there were the questions about if the anti-corruption court would be established. So really, how strong is the position of the Western partners, and how big is really this issue?
I think it is quite, there is no full unanimity of the various actors on this issue. For some we know that for Trump administration, maybe this anti-corruption agenda is not so much in the focus like in the previous Obama's administration. However, what we may identify is that personally for the State Secretary Tillerson, this is very important part of the agenda, and certainly United States is among those actors who strongly require from Ukraine to establish really independent anti-corruption court. And certainly this issue was raised during all the meetings which Ukrainian top official had.
One of the most important meetings was, of course, with the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Legarde, but as well, it was like a pretty positive feedback we hear that things are moving on. But really, what would be the criteria? What you can, write? What we can read to be a successful? What could be considered to be success? And particularly for IMF, for further cooperation.
I think that the issue with IMF is not easy. It is really complicated. It is really not just limited to the issue of anti-corruption court. I think if it is just only about the court, it some way the progress may be ensured. But we have much more complicated issues there, especially when it comes to the land reform, introduction of the full-scale land market, which is, the idea is very rational but very unpopular here in Ukraine. And it is very unlikely that the most of political forces will vote for that before elections. And so that makes me a little bit skeptical when it comes to the prospect of the next stages of cooperation with IMF. It is really needed, and Ukraine will need external funds in order to pay for the debts next year. And the question is where there are maybe not so much sources when Ukraine can get it. But again, the price which IMF now requires is quite higher. And the anti-corruption court is just one of them. And as far as I understand, on the Ukrainian political level, there are hesitations. If the leaders of the country and the government, how they count, if they can survive without these funds or not before elections. Because really, there are some very painful requirements which they feel, the leaders of the country feel very uncomfortable to push forward before elections.
Besides that, what I understand from other analysts, that the issue of privatization is also on the top, because, the land reform looks a bit like less likely, and it's not something which is really expected. But those are the issues which are expected. What are your thoughts on that?
So here there is a big question: where is the benchmark? So because if certainly there is a step done just a few weeks ago that the new legislation was adopted, which make easier to put forward privatization. It was a new law adopted. But probably it is not sufficient to be successful, because now the assets are the prices of the major assets are not higher, and the expectations of the government again quite different from they can get immediately. So, and the case of Odessa port plant, for example, was an example how the difficulty. So really, any asset may expect same problem when it is pushed for privatization. So the question, where is the benchmark? So we don't know that, certainly, if the benchmark is a proper conditions, transparent rules, which allow any international investor to come and to buy, it can be achieved. But on the other hand, if the benchmark is successful contract done on privatization, I'm not so sure, because we may look back and we will see that all the efforts to sell any essential asset failed last couple of years. So could we expect this change? I'm not sure. Maybe lots of efforts to be done in order to get success here, because it is not sufficient from the government just to adopt a legislation. It is also important to attract real investors and to accomplish a deal.
Oleksandr, so overall, I mean, it's not the first year you are there. Why this this meeting, or like this Davos visit? It's not exactly where the decisions are taken, but for us, for the Ukrainians, it's where we can, how we are saying, measure the temperature. You know, are people speaking that reforms are too slow? Are they more concerned about Russian aggression? So, at that regard, what are really, we already discussed some issues, but if to sum it up, you know, what was the mood? What would be the words you would describe in Ukraine's relations with its partners?
So it's very easy to say that reforms are slow. It's also very easy to say that Ukraine is not so much successful as somebody may expect. But what is more important is to what extent Ukraine is a part of the global processes. If it is going closer to the leaders of the world, or it is going to the margin, becoming the actor who is not in the focus, not just in the focus, but also not moving toward the mainstream of the global development. And here, that was a major question at the meeting. So if Ukraine may succeed, not just improve its GDP, not just improve its ratings like corruption perception ratings or doing business ratings, but mostly it is about, is Ukraine coming closer to the global trends of economy? And so I think that the positive part of the answer is that this is my observation, is that more and more actors, including Ukrainian politicians, businessmen, really understand that this is important.
At the same time, this Friday, during the last meeting of the President with State Secretary Tillerson, the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine Negotiations, Volker, had met with the Russian presidential assistant, Vladislav Surkov. They've met in Dubai. This time, according to the Russian official media, they talked about the prospect of sending UN peacekeepers to Donbas. I would like to show what the Russian politician had said. So we would hear that, the quote of Vladislav Surkov.
The main thing in the U.S. proposal is a rather detailed plan for a phased deployment of the UN mission in coordination with the implementation of the political points of the Minsk Agreements. This is a balanced approach on which we have insisted. We will study it carefully and promptly give an answer. Then we will invite Kurt and his colleagues to a new meeting.
We know just what we know from the Russian media so far. We're waiting for the time when Kurt Volker would comment the issue himself. But really, besides what we already discussed, how probable so far looks this launching of the UN peacekeepers mission? From what you can hear on the sidewalks of the forum, talking to the experts, European, Americans, maybe Ukrainians as well.
I would like to hear from the US part what kind of progress they may identify, if they do. Because here we do not have any concrete information on the issues which were resolved, if they were resolved. My perception is main parts are still far from the consensus on the major issues. For example, I understand that the major issue is who and which way the peacekeeping mission is created, what would be the procedure, who will control, what will be the place, what will be the mandate of this peacekeeping mission. For example, for Ukraine, the most important thing is that Russia is not a part of this peacekeeping mission. For Russia, the major point is that Russia is essential part of this mission. if there is some process, some progress possible to achieve at least some steps in order to accommodate these two antagonistic positions, I don't know. I didn't have any indication of the progress on these particular issues. And then, as many others, certainly there is some, I would say, efforts, and these efforts are significant from various sides, to achieve at least something, at least some progress to achieve and then to report, because otherwise it will look like a failure, total failure, which is not in the interests of major actors. So they probably need to identify at least some progress to report. But when it comes to the final solution, I think that we are still far from it.
Thank you. Oleksandr Sushko is now the executive director of the International Relations Foundations here in Kiev, and one of the best Ukrainian experts on the Ukrainian transatlantic relations, just coming from Davos. Thanks for elaborating what was there.